here to talk to Jim Cambronne. I've been a friend of Jim's and an admirer of his work for about 50 years, I believe, and I'm pleased to be able to talk to us. Now, Jim, you've had a storied career, but one of your early, really significant paintings was Salon of Mysteries, which is right next to us here. And before we talk about your career that went along, maybe you could talk to us briefly about this painting.
Well, this painting was, a commission, and I was trying to make my living as a young artist in Sioux Falls, and I had been working as a sign painter and also as a cartoonist, and then I was able to just start making my own work. And something I didn't know at the time, but it turned out in my favor, was that every small city across the country can support a few different artists. And turns out Sioux Falls could support one or two. And what was happening was I couldn't really get any work as a young artist because a lot of the best artists at that time were teaching in the universities and colleges. And so what happened were a lot of projects would come up that were either too low pay or not interesting enough for the other artists that were more experienced. And so they'd just say, "Oh, Jim, he's working full-time as an artist. Go over there, see if he'd be interested in doing it." And so a number of my early projects came to me that way. And then, of course, just like everybody, you make friends, and I met a lot of people from across the state, and one of the people I met was a young man named Jeff Wirt, and he was working for, I believe at the time, Spitznagel Partners. And he and I worked on 3 different projects, and he had gotten the job to design the interior of the Lafayette restaurant and bar. And he was particularly working on the bar and asked me if I'd submit some proposals to the owners for this, what turned out to be this painting.
Want to describe anything about the painting, the allegories? What little bit of detail, just to get us into the painting a little bit?
Mm-hmm. Well, the painting is I think the major idea in the painting is using various objects and time frames and ways of coming to representation. So in some of the painting there are pictures taken from photographs. In some cases there's a person painted from life, like over here on the couch. That was, I didn't have the couch, and so the couch actually comes from a photograph, but the woman sleeping on the couch, of course, is very real. And she came up to the upstairs of the old courthouse museum where I was painting this painting. And I think I just had a bench, and she put her head down with a pillow on the bench and just fell asleep. And I drew her, and later took some color notes and then painted her later. But that came from life, and then other things were from photographs and different time periods. So I'm mixing all of those different forms together into a single fiction.
Well, it's my understanding that you're going to shortly retire from your position to have a university art department in Boston, and that you're going to devote full time then, once again, to your paintings, which is great. Before we go and talk about the current project that you have, maybe you could talk a little bit about the path your art career has taken up to this point.
Well, in high school, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to be, and I thought I wanted to be an astronomer. That was kind of what was leading me, so most of my education was oriented towards math and science. And then I would have been able to graduate at 17, but I was too afraid, and from a relatively poor family, and didn't know how to get to college. So I decided to stay on another year or two at school, and I thought I'd like to take some art courses. And I did, and I had a really wonderful teacher. How it all started, where I started to get serious, was I started with a kind of a terrible thing that actually happened. My parents were not really able to provide food for us, and most of it was things that at the time my father was, catching fish, and so it was like fish and spaghetti, and I kind of went on my own little rebellion, like I didn't think I was going to eat any more fish and spaghetti, and I passed out in the cafeteria at school because I didn't have any food to take to school, so I just was walking through there and I passed out. Our high school counselor happened to be Donna S. Brown, who was the person who was helped found the South Dakota Art Museum. And so Donna Brown talked to the art teacher, and he said, "This kid's really talented." And the next year, there was a national painting competition that Hallmark Cards used to sponsor. 20,000 entries. A winner from each state got to go to be in a show in Kansas City at the corporate headquarters, I guess. And I got 4th place in that. And that came with a modest scholarship to the school, the Art Institute of Chicago. And a friend of mine in the art department said she was thinking about going to Augustana, and maybe I should come too. And I thought, okay, that sounds good. So I came down and interviewed with Carl Grupp at Augustana, and I loved what he had to say. And then I started digging in and saw that Carl and Palmer Heidi here were, really true artists, and that I maybe didn't have to go to Chicago. And my advisor back in Huron said, who's different than donuts, don't worry about the money, somehow it'll come your way, and it did. I got scholarships and got some good jobs in Sioux Falls related to art. And when I came back to Sioux Falls, after finishing at Augustana, I came back to Sioux Falls and started as resident artist at the Siouxland Heritage Museums. From there, I went to graduate school at Yale University School of Art. And I was a little bit intimidated. Some of my classmates are exceptionally famous artists today. Some of the students I had there too are as well. And what happened after my first year, the director of graduate studies came and asked me if I'd be interested in teaching. And I had just gotten married, and I talked to my wife about it, and I said, well, I never wanted to be a teacher. My parents thought it would be a good idea to get an art education degree, and I told them to fall back on. And they said, well, if I have something to fall back on, I'll fall back on it. So I said, okay, I'll just tell them I'm interested. She said, yeah, that's a good idea. See what happens, what they have in mind. And the director of graduate studies came and talked to me and said, we think you are a gifted teacher, and we'd like to offer you a full-time job teaching here for 2 years, give you some experience. And then I had an opportunity to teach in California. I went to California to Cal Arts and was a part of the first faculty for the California High School for the Arts. Also simultaneous with that, I was in a major show of new talent in Boston, and then I was also in a traveling show that toured in England, in like 3 or 4 different venues in England. And then when I came back, I moved to Maine. My wife stayed in New Haven and did some house sitting, and my new son. And then we moved up to Maine, and we were there 10 years. And While I was there, I did a residency, artist residency at Anderson Ranch in Colorado, and taught almost two jobs at once. One semester at Bowdoin College for a sabbatical, fill in, plus kept my full-time job at Maine College of Art. And then my wife finally was able to go to grad school. She had been ill for a while, and we decided to go to California, and she went to Mills College, which is a women's college, but it's really pretty well known for visual arts and dance and theater and education. So she went to grad school there, and I taught at the first term at University of California, Berkeley, and then at San Francisco Art Institute, and then I kind of held two positions for a year. I don't know how I did all this, but at Portland State University, I filled in for a year for their senior artist who was on sabbatical. And somehow during that time I had also my first shows in New York City at Tibor Denage Gallery, and in San Francisco at Paula Anglin Gallery, and then in Boston at Nielsen Gallery. And then I had just started showing in a really good gallery in Maine where I was living at Icon Gallery. So 4 shows really quickly, and you know, at some certain point, the pay was really low at the Art Institute. They probably hate me for saying that, but I had to find a decent paying job, so I applied for a few schools and was a finalist at 3 of them, and I took the job at Massachusetts College of Art and Design. So I've been there, and I've been showing, you know, both in New York and San Francisco and Maine and in Boston. So now I'm almost done, so I'm going to plan to stay in the East Coast, I think, and devote all my time to my work.
Well, you're almost done in terms of teaching.
Yeah, but not done in terms of being an artist. No.
Far from it, we hope.
Right.
You mentioned the name of somebody that was a mutual friend of ours, Carl Grubb. Mm-hmm. And of course, maybe you would like to say a little more about the influences that he had on your art.
He's sort of like introduced me to what it meant to be a serious artist. And I know when I was finishing at Yale, one of their major artists and teachers there, 3 of them gave me advice. I asked them for advice about teaching, and Melvin Bachner said to me that one of the primary things you do as an art teacher is you are one example of how to be an artist, and that was what Carl did. He wasn't heavy-handed in what you did or who you turned out to be, but he showed you how to be an artist. And I was lucky to come to Augustana rather than maybe school, the Art Institute of Chicago, where I'm sure the teachers, because of the number of students that they had and how they had to go about, you know, balancing their careers as artists with their teaching, I would never have been able to get a look on the inside of what it meant to be an artist. And so Carl was just really good at, you know, encouraging us all to immerse ourselves in art, that we weren't, like visual art was more expansive than just visual art, that we were connected to all the artists. And we were a small group, but we spent a lot of time with each other talking about things and learning that a lot of the education doesn't take place in the classroom, but takes place between each other in study groups, or just talking about things we don't understand that maybe we learn, try to figure out how it applies to us or the world. So Carl was really just good in opening up his life to his son. I don't think all students, but students that were interested, he would be able to, you know, have a personal relationship with him.
What about, my understanding is that you have a great regard for the continuity of art, both in instruction as well as in maybe the performance of art. Do you want to talk something about the continuity?
So, first day, I was at Yale. They got all of the graduate school students together. The dean of the school at that time, David Pease, said, "You can't do this alone. And you need each other." And he said, "What we hope that you will do, or expect what you will do, is to put your egos behind you and be kind and supportive to one another, because when you get into the world, you're going to need each other. So if something happens for you and you can't do it, you pass it on to one of your classmates, or part of your, not necessarily your classmates, but part of your artistic family, the people that you know and work with." And that was one of the things that Carl, I think, exhibited, going back to what Faulkner said as a role model, is he created community. And that is something that Sioux Falls and the state have really benefited from, creating this idea that if we need to be mutually supportive of one another. It's like always trying to make connections across disciplines and within disciplines, and even within your own thinking. He was very good about showing us how an artist thought and what was underneath the thing that you're going to do. So it's sort of that old story about you can get much farther if you teach somebody how to fish rather than giving them the fish. The study of art, no matter what art it is, but particularly in visual art, goes back all the way, caves and before. And this is one of the only professions in the world that has an unbroken continuity between that era and now. And even though we may think that in Middle Ages or this or that, it's been broken, it really hasn't. We are passing down the information that we've learned and the information that we have developed from one generation to the next. And that some of the people that you're passing it on to is like a seed, and it will take and sprout. And others will just pass by. But this information that we're learning here, you have a responsibility to keep it going, of transferring your knowledge to the other. In a sense that, this person, I studied with this person, who studied with this person, who studied with this person, who studied with this person, all the way back along those lines. How about that? So then I started thinking about it back in terms of my own life, and then I realized, Palmer Eide, who taught here, started the art program, he studied with Walter Gropius, who founded the Bauhaus, directly. He studied with Herbert Bayer, who is basically the communication design teacher at the Bauhaus. He studied painting in Chicago, at the Chicago, Illinois campus, with the painter and designer Mahaly Naj. He studied architecture, graduate architecture, at the same campus with Mies van der Rohe. And one of his best friends was the scholar, the British Indian scholar Adnan Coomaraswamy, who started the major Asian art collection at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. They carried on a lifelong correspondence. He was friends with Eero Saarinen. He started at Yale, and he started with George Kubler, who had just retired when I went to Yale, who was the major expert on Mayan art and who wrote The Shape of Time. And then Carl, You know, he's studied with we share one teacher in common. We studied with at Yale. One of his teachers was a student of Max Beckmann's and Ben Shawn, Philip Guston. So Carl is like only 1 degree away from these people. In the Western European art, there's 2 trees. There's many more trees than that come from China, Africa, India, Japan, that are all kind of branching out. So Carl's really from one of the trees. It's kind of an interesting thing to think of, like, okay, like, you know, we're part of a big family. We're relatives in the sense that wisdom and technique and ideas are being passed from generation to generation.
You know, the written art history and the written instruction materials and so on are one thing, but how much of the art history that is being passed down that you're talking about is oral and visual?
And a lot of it is, actually. So in relationship to that, one of my teachers at Yale in printmaking was Gabor Paterdi. And Gabor Paterdi is an interesting figure in American art and also European art. And he taught in the oral tradition. He was sent as a 10-year-old to Italy to study art. So by the time he was 17, he was through his art studies, he moved to Paris. And Gabor started in the print shop that Stanley Hayter had formed there called Atelier 17, which was kind of both a school and a professional workshop and a studio. His best friends were Juan Miro, Marc Chagall, and Max Ernst. As our young artist in the workshop, he'd be telling me stories while I worked almost the whole time. So one of those stories he told me, he was a young artist working in the print shop. Pablo Picasso was coming to the print shop to make prints, and they would print them there, and sometimes he would work there. And so Gabor got assigned to Picasso as like his guy to sharpen tools. He thought, well, I'll sharpen his tools, I'll probably not even see him. Well, when Picasso would come for his tools, he would do just what Gabor was doing with me. He sat down beside him for to sharpen that many tools, about 4 hours worth of work. He sat there for 4 hours with Gabor and talked to him about art and life, for I think a course of 5 or 6 years. So this kind of idea of, things passing on, and then just like the stories that was passing on, knowledge and information. And so I knew that I didn't need to take what he was talking to me literally. What I had to do was I had to understand exactly why it was he was telling me this story, why he thought it was important that I hear this at this point in time, and to try to then extrapolate and apply it to my work. So everyone has maybe a set of stories that you maybe collect. Like Carl had a set of stories, and every once in a while you get a new one, and that would be exciting, at least for me, to hear a new story. This collection of stories, like you have as a teacher, you may have a portfolio of stories. And once in a while, in order for you to bring a piece of information to life, you want to try to connect it to a person or to an event rather than it is just dry, literal information. And so those stories kind of become your avenue to bring, what you're doing to life, make it connect to the world around you. And that's really at the bottom line of what's the most important thing about fine art, no matter what art discipline you do, you re-examine these things and you reanimate them or reimagine them for your fellow human beings, so that they understand that if they took a little bit time or they slowed down, they might be able to see something they hadn't seen before, or they'd forgotten that they'd seen before. And it would connect to them in a different time and place in a new and more powerful way. It's about making connections. And so you want to learn how to connect with yourself, and connect with an audience, connect with other people. There's a difference between bringing something to life as art experientially or by talking about it or telling it. My wife, Nancy, had gotten a full scholarship to the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, which is kind of a renowned summer program. So she's there with a wonderful artist, from California, and they're both mothers. So they challenge each other to make a work about what it feels like to be a mother. So she decides that she's going to make this experiential. So the idea was to swaddle the viewer. So you would climb into this thing. And what she decides to do is she starts thinking about, I think, drawing upon her Catholic background, the swaddling clothes, the swaddling of a baby. And like that wrapping around tight with the blanket when they're young and keeping them close, when they feel safer. She takes her whole studio. She gets this extremely long length and quite wide piece of cheesecloth. And she basically creates a hammock from, attached to one wall and to the other wall. And it creates this beautiful white arc. There's a skylight in the studio, so the light reflects off the arc up onto the walls. It's just kind of the serene thing. She took and she painted. She decided to reverse, which is a kind of a poetic thing, the sky and the ground. So she painted the floor blue, like the color of the sky, and above she strung another, but only flat this time, hammock across the whole space, arc across the space. And then she gathered this beautiful pink grass that was out in the fields at Skowhegan. And then they filled it, not really thick, but so you could see through it. The whole top of the thing was with the pink grass. So when you actually experienced this piece, you felt like you were completely transported in space and time. And so the feeling came across more like what she was trying to communicate was experiential, so the feeling became embodied.
So that's really an installation, which of course the art world is opened up to.
Right. I haven't done a lot of them, but I've done 4 major ones. And one was at Anderson Ranch called Tonus, and I just did one not so long ago called Where What Is. Both of them actually take on some of the things I explored in here. Where What Is set up like a narrative journey, but in space. And so it's an idea that at each station, as you move through, a different sort of philosophical or existential question is asked of you, visually. The other one, Tonus, really also included sound, and part of it was also connected to a story that John Cage told. Cage went to Harvard and they had an anechoic chamber there. He wanted to experience this, and apparently if you go in there, you're not supposed to be able to hear any sound. He came out of the anechoic chamber and he spoke to the technician. He said, it's not silent in there. I heard sound. And the technician said to him, well, what did you hear? He said, I heard a high-pitched sound and I heard a low-pitched sound like rushing, that was like rushing. The technician said, oh, that's easy. He said, the high-pitched sound is the sound of your nervous system, and the low-pitched sound is your blood rushing through your body. So if all of the sound is taken away and all you have left is like silence, like Octavio Paz would say, is full of noise. And, so I love that story, and it became part of the basis for the thinking of the installation. The poet Robert Frost decided that he would interview all of the people who wanted to be in class at Breadloaf and ask the same question each time. What will break your heart if you found out it wasn't true? And when I think back on my life as an artist, and I think about that question, I understand why that question would be so effective in beginning to, track with who would be a good student for you and who might not be. Because the way that you answer that question, I think, would give you a lot of information about the values someone might have and what they really care about in terms of their feelings. I discovered at a certain point that mixing kind of fact and fiction into a short, beautiful form where a new kind of reality would come into existence is something that I was interested in. Combining all these different signs and symbols and artifacts and things from different time periods, present and past and maybe future, and putting them all into the same space. So my new work actually, instead of using signs and symbols or images, and images can be words, they're visual words, I use actually visual languages from other cultures. Things from, say, the South Dakota here, the Native American art. I'm looking at, say, de style, like a Dutch abstraction or suprematism, Persian carpets, Persian Indo painting, like miniatures, and the list Jain painting, tantric painting, and the list could go on across many different cultures. And in the paintings, what I do is I'm also using this idea of setting things into three. So there was a Matisse painting I saw. It was in a vertical form, but it was three bands. And so I started thinking about that in my Western experience, moving across spaces. The idea of a zone, like a time zone. It's like you get up in the morning and you're in one space in your bedroom. You get your clothes on, you're in maybe another space, like in your living room, or you're eating breakfast. You walk out the door and you're in another space, then you're in a transportation space, or you're walking or whatever you're doing, then you're at work. And as you move across that space, you're the one thing that's constant, because it's your psyche and it's you moving through the space. And you actually are affecting the space as you walk through it. You're at least moving the air. And the space is actually affecting you as you move through it. And so it's a little bit like, in simple terms, like Joseph Albers running a single color through three different bands of color. And as it moves through those bands of color, it changes sometimes value and hue, depending on how the color it's interacting with. There's this interesting thing that I'm trying to speak about that takes on a different kind of model in this project that I'm calling the Days of May. There's a painting for each day in May. And it's a single piece, even though they do have some similarities. Each one has got its own personality, and rather than just being a clone of the last one. I'm thinking of the 31 days as like a collection of poems. People are always wanting to break up the pieces, but I really see it as a whole. I'm taking like a thread in common from various languages, and I'm weaving them together, not in a collage form, but in a form sort of like maybe the way you would think Mozart putting a piece together with various voices in the conversation, without me assuming really any one of the voices, but also being part of the voice, like I facilitate the conversation as a painter. These pieces are meant to kind of speak to each other. So if you put more than one together, like in a group, like I've done in the Days of May, that as you start to see what I choose and not choose and how I put them together, you will see that this isn't like appropriation or a following of something, but it's an attempt to create a conversation between different visual languages and hopefully within yourself, like an alternative to a sort of dialectic idea of synthesis. I'm going to open up to like whoever's listening to this about how this artist thinks. So I say to myself, okay, so abstract expressionists are always saying everything is about color and color and feeling. So why is it, no matter what way you paint, that color is always associated with feeling? What is up with that? And why is it with most abstract expressionist work that say, well, maybe this is about anger, but all of the paintings seem then like they're about anger? What is up with that? And so a couple things that I started to understand actually, that color is contextual. You can't understand color unless you have it in relationship to something else or to another color. So it's always changing, and because of that, it's hard to systematize. It can be, but it's hard. It's kind of like life in the sense that it always wants to break free and do its own thing. And so color is contextual, and so is emotion. If you put a color into play in relationship to its surroundings, then it has a better chance of coming across as pure feeling, rather than if you applied a sort of symbolic idea, which is another way to use color, is to let the color find its emotion. Then the more complex thing about emotion in, say, painting or other works of art is that in India they have an idea. It is an aesthetic emotion, which is an emotion that is a constellation of emotions. So like when you're making a work of art, you probably can live a whole life in a work of art as you're making it. And so the emotions that usually arise out of a painting is like not a single emotion, but a constellation of emotions. You will see what the meaning is, where you might not pick it up in the particular painting to painting, but as a whole, you start to get the idea of what I'm working on and why it might be interesting.
Painting that is, I found out from you, has quite a backstory that I didn't know about. Mm-hmm. And so, if you would, I'd like to have you talk about it. It has to do with, as I understand it, Lester Johnson, who was a well-regarded artist as well as a professor of yours at Yale. Mm-hmm. So, if you talk about my painting for a bit.
Okay. So, I did a series of paintings, and this one actually was the first one. So my mentor here at Augustana, Carl Grupp, was a great admirer, as many of his peers from Minneapolis, of the artist Lester Johnson, who was a St. Paul, Minneapolis artist that went to New York. And when I was his student, he was sort of had been lifted up because in the early to mid 80s, art movement called Neo-Expressionism was kind of the vanguard movement. Carl had given me like about 20 years of art news and Art in America magazines, and I had been in some boxes that he, of course, didn't want to carry around anymore, but it was like a treasure trove for me, because it kind of gave me a perspective on artists who were really, popular at one time, and then over the course of time they just sort of disappeared. Lester Johnson was someone who was constantly in those magazines over the years, And so knowing Carl's love for him, knowing some of Lester's early work, and the fact that at the graduate school at that time, the walls in the graduate studios only came up like 8 feet. There was a couple feet beyond that at open air. So on the studio on either side of you, you could hear the critique that was being given to the students on either side of you, which was actually also learning vicariously, which is another whole thing in itself. So I would hear Lester speaking to the student on the other side of me, giving him the most marvelous critiques. So I was anxious. I finally was able to get on his list so I could see him in my studio. I was excited. He came to my studio and he looked around, not saying anything. Of course, that makes you a little bit nervous. Silence is always a little bit nerve-wracking. And he sits down with me and he says, "You're Jim, right?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "I understand you're from out west." And I said, "Yes, I'm from South Dakota." And he just nods. And he said, "I don't really know if you're the best artist who's come through here or the worst." He said, "I'd like you to do me a favor. I'd like you to paint me a cliche. And if you can do that well, I'll know the answer to my question." And so I thought it through. I asked him, I said, "So like cliche, what do you mean by cliche?" And he says, like a barbed wire fence going along the road off into the distance and the sunset. Or like out here, maybe some rocks by the ocean in a lighthouse. And I said, "Okay, I think I get it." He says, "Paint me a cliche and we'll see what happens." And so before he left, I said, so like a cliche, like if I paint a sunset, that would be like a cliche?" He says, "Yeah, paint a sunset. You know that." And I said, "Yeah, I know that." So I decided, like, what am I going to do? So I had this little square painting. I said, that's an unusual format for a landscape. And so, like, I'll start there. Out west, like the sun is like the whole thing, like at the sunset, like it's really big. But what if I made it like as big, almost as big as the whole painting? And I made the landscape really small, like say in a Turner painting, like a William Turner painting, watercolor or oil painting of a romantic space. And so I'll paint the landscape, but I'm only gonna give it like half an inch or something on the bottom of the painting. And then I'm gonna paint the sky lifting up, and this thing is gonna be just fill in the sky. And so then I said, well, okay, now that I got that idea, so what should I do in terms of color? So the obvious thing to do would be to paint it red. So I was just taking a color class for the first time, like the Elbers class, and I thought, okay, what if I made the sky and I painted the base of the painting, the main color of the background, army green, instead of like blue or some, and then I'll take manganese violet, not red, and I'll paint the sun, and I won't paint it like a disc, I'll paint it like an orb, and which I did in this painting. So I talked to Lester in a private moment about this. He explained it in a sort of cryptic way. He says, like, how many lighthouse paintings have you seen? I said, probably hundreds, thousands. He said, how many do you remember that are really great paintings? I said, like 2 or 3, 4. And he said, well, there's 5 or 6 of them. And he said, 3 of them are painted by Edward Hopper. And he said, so why is it that, this painting, there's been so many paintings made of it, that only 3, 4, 5 of them are any good? That's why I asked you to paint a cliche. I wanted to see what you would do with it. Would you actually paint an actual cliche, or would you transcend the cliche and make a painting that had some kind of resonance? So I made the painting, put it up on the wall. I invited Lester to come back in to see me. And he comes back into my studio. He said, "Did you finish the painting?" I said, "I did, Lester. It's this one on the wall." And he looked at the painting for a long time. I mean, it probably wasn't that long, but 2, 3, 5 minutes can feel like an eternity. Not saying a word. And he looks at me and he says, "I have nothing to teach you." And he walks out.